What if I told you that one of France's most celebrated war heroes, praised by kings, blessed by the church, and immortalized alongside Joan of Arc, would one day become one of history's most monstrous killers? This is not folklore, not some medieval ghost story whispered around tavern fires. This is the real account of Gilles de Rais, the Golden Knight who fought for God in the 100 Years' War, only to descend into a darkness so deep it would devour hundreds of innocent lives. And before this tale is over, you will see why the same man who once stood beside a saint would be remembered as a demon in human form. Hit that subscribe button because the truth you're about to hear is far more disturbing than any horror movie. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 into unimaginable privilege. His family's estates sprawled across Brittany and Anjou, their lands so vast they seemed to roll on without end. Castles, vineyards, hunting grounds, every luxury the medieval world could offer was his by birthright. And yet beneath the glittering surface of this fortune lay a boy with a hunger not for comfort, but for glory. From the moment he could lift a sword, Gilles sought out the life of a warrior, driven by an insatiable need to carve his name into the history of France. At 16, when most noble sons were still learning diplomacy or court etiquette, Gilles plunged into the 100 Years' War. He showed a rare talent for strategy and an almost reckless bravery on the battlefield. Arrows whistled past his helm, steel clanged against his armor, and still he pressed forward. It wasn't long before whispers spread among the French ranks about the young noble whose fearlessness seemed touched by divine favor. Then in 1429, fate brought him to the side of a girl whose name would echo for centuries, Joan of Arc. She claimed God had commanded her to lead the Dauphin to his coronation, a claim most nobles dismissed with scorn. But Gilles saw something in her, an unshakable conviction, a spark that matched the fire in his own heart. Without hesitation, he threw his fortune, his soldiers, and his sword behind her cause. Together, they became an unstoppable force. Gilles fought beside Joan at the lifting of the siege of Orléans, cutting through English lines with a precision and ferocity that inspired the men around him. He marched with her to Reims, standing proudly at her side as the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII of France. That moment, trumpets blaring, banners unfurling the air thick with incense and triumph, was the height of his glory. At just 24, Gilles de Rais had everything medieval society admired: wealth, bravery, loyalty, and the blessing of both king and church. For his service, Gilles was awarded the title of Marshal of France, the highest military honor the kingdom could bestow. His name became synonymous with valor. Mothers told their sons to be like Gilles. Poets immortalized his victories in verse. He was the golden boy of France, the living proof that chivalry still had a place in a war-torn world. But dreams in the Middle Ages had a cruel way of turning into nightmares. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. A year later, she was burned at the stake. Gilles, who had shared in her triumphs, now shared in her grief. Those who knew him said something inside him cracked that day. The knight who had once charged into battle for God now withdrew from public life, retreating to his estates like a wounded animal seeking the shadows. What followed was a transformation as strange as it was unsettling. Gilles began spending money with reckless abandon, hosting theatrical productions, so elaborate they could bankrupt small kingdoms. Costumes sewn with gold thread, entire towns hired as actors, banquets that lasted for days, his gatherings became the stuff of legend. Yet, for all the spectacle, there was a hollowness in his eyes, as though each act of extravagance was an attempt to fill a void that could never be filled. Then came the whispers. Servants spoke of strange books filled with arcane symbols. Alchemists and so-called sorcerers arrived at the castle offering to transmute base metals into gold. Not that Gilles needed more wealth, but perhaps he needed the illusion of purpose. The villagers spoke of flickering lights in the windows at ungodly hours, of eerie chants drifting through the night air. And then children began to vanish. At first, it was just one or two, always from poor families who believed the castle might offer their children a better life. They were told their sons had been sent to serve in noble households or had gone to study in distant cities. But weeks passed, then months, and the children never returned. No one dared accuse the Marshal of France directly. Who would question a hero of Orléans? But the pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. Young boys between 8 and 12 with fair hair and delicate features. The hunting ground was expanding, and the predator wore the face of a knight. Behind the thick stone walls of his estates, Gilles devised a sinister method for acquiring victims. He dispatched loyal servants to nearby villages, offering promises of employment, choir practice, or education within the castle. To desperate parents, it seemed like salvation, a chance for their children to escape poverty. They could not imagine they were delivering their sons into the hands of France's most decorated knight, only to be swallowed by a nightmare no one could comprehend. Once inside, the children were treated with a disarming kindness. They were given fine clothes, sat at tables laden with delicacies, and allowed to wander gilded halls they had only dreamed of. For a moment, they believed themselves chosen, elevated from obscurity. But the warmth was a mask, and soon enough they were ushered into darker chambers where the air reeked of smoke and iron, and the doors closed with an echo that felt like a coffin sealing shut. Witnesses later recalled that Gilles took his time relishing the fear in their eyes. Sometimes he forced them into mock religious ceremonies, parodies of the faith he once claimed to fight for. The flicker of torches cast grotesque shadows on the walls, making children appear like trembling phantoms. Each ritual was a cruel inversion of the Church's promise of salvation, as if he meant to prove that the divine had abandoned them long before their final moments. Servants described how Gilles' mood would shift suddenly from calm and polite to something almost inhuman. He would silence their screams with restraints, his voice sharp with command, while the sound of chains rattled through the chamber. Methods varied, sometimes swift and brutal, sometimes prolonged and meticulous. A short, double-edged sword, the braquemard, was often mentioned, always gleaming with a precision that felt rehearsed. For Gilles, cruelty was not chaos, it was performance. One of the earliest documented victims was a 12-year-old apprentice named Joan. He had been promised an opportunity to serve in the choir. His family rejoiced, believing their son had found his way to a brighter future. But days turned to weeks, and no letters came. No messages returned. When his disappearance was finally investigated, Gilles' servants spun tales of Joan being sent to another estate. The truth, revealed later in trial, testimony was far darker. Joan had been among the first sacrificed to the Marshal's secret appetite. Gilles' accomplices spoke of how he sometimes admired the lifeless bodies afterward, brushing hair from pale faces or arranging them as though they were dolls in a macabre display. On occasion, he would preserve the corpses for days, returning to them with a fascination that unsettled even his most loyal attendants. The castle's furnaces glowed at odd hours, swallowing the evidence in flames. And yet the whispers outside the castle walls grew louder. Why were so many children vanishing? What made his crimes even more horrifying was his belief that he acted in pursuit of power. Obsessed with alchemy and the occult, Gilles convinced himself that the blood of innocent children could grant him wealth beyond measure, or even resurrect Joan of Arc. In his deranged vision, these killings were not just indulgences, they were sacrifices to forces he believed could bend destiny itself. Thus, the man who had once been hailed as God's champion now sought to bargain with the devil. By the mid-1430s, the number of victims had risen into the dozens, perhaps even hundreds. Some families dared to question, but they were silenced by intimidation or blinded by the marshal's noble status. Who would believe a grieving peasant mother over a celebrated knight of France? Authority itself became Gilles' shield, and every passing year gave him more confidence that he was untouchable. The silence of society became the echo chamber in which his atrocities multiplied, but no fortune lasts forever. Gilles' reckless spending, his extravagant plays and banquets began to drain even his colossal wealth. By the late 1430s, creditors circled like vultures. Bishops, nobles, even the church itself demanded repayment. Gilles, unwilling to surrender his grandeur, sold off lands that had been in his family for generations. The Marshal of France was rotting not only in spirit, but also in fortune, his estates crumbling like the facade of his honor. It was desperation that finally broke his armor. In 1440, when church officials pressed too hard for repayment, Gilles did the unthinkable. He kidnapped a priest and held him ransom. For the first time, his enemies had a legal pretext to strike. Nobles, who had long ignored the whispers of missing children, now had reason to act not to avenge the innocent, but to protect their own interests. And thus began the downfall of the Golden Knight turned butcher of children. The arrest of Gilles de Rais shook France like thunder. Here was a man who had stood beside Joan of Arc, now dragged in chains through the very streets where he once rode as a hero. Crowds gathered not only out of outrage, but out of disbelief. How could the savior of Orléans be accused of crimes so vile that even whispers felt unbearable to speak aloud? The spectacle was no longer hidden in shadow. The entire kingdom was watching. The trial of 1440 became a medieval theater in its own right, with two courts, the ecclesiastical and the civil, vying to expose his sins. The church accused him of heresy, witchcraft, and sodomy. The secular court charged him with murder. Together, the weight of these accusations pressed like a millstone on his neck. He, who once wore medals of honor, now sat before judges as a criminal, his glory stripped away. One by one, witnesses were paraded into the courtroom. Peasant families trembling as they recounted the day their sons vanished. Mothers sobbing as they described sending their children to the castle, believing they were walking into opportunity, not oblivion. The words hung heavy in the air, each testimony painting the image of a predator shielded by nobility. Every tear shed was another nail hammered into Gilles' coffin. Then came the servants. Men who had once obeyed his commands now spoke with trembling voices about what they had seen. They described the mock ceremonies, the cries muffled by stone walls, the cold precision with which their master carried out the killings. Some recounted the smell of burning flesh in the castle furnaces, a scent that clung to their memories like smoke in their lungs. The courtroom itself seemed to choke on the horror being unveiled, and yet despite the avalanche of testimony, doubts lingered. Historians ever since have asked, was this all truth, or partly a setup? Gilles' creditors, bishops, nobles, even members of the king's inner circle stood to gain enormously if he fell. His vast estates could be seized, his debts erased. The timing was suspicious. Could it be that his downfall was engineered, that his monstrous crimes were exaggerated for political ends? The question still haunts history. But what cannot be denied is Gilles' own confession. Under the threat of torture and excommunication, he admitted everything and more. He gave graphic, unnecessary detail, recounting the very methods he used, the feelings he experienced while watching the life leave a child's body. His words turned the courtroom into a chamber of nightmares, every sentence another descent into the abyss of his soul. Whether coerced or voluntary, the confession sealed his fate. Strangely, as he spoke, he seemed almost relieved. It was as if he had carried a weight too monstrous for one man to bear, and by releasing it, he finally unmasked himself before the world. Some said he wept in genuine repentance. Others believed it was one last performance by a man who had always sought an audience. Whatever the truth, the effect was devastating. The people who once hailed him as hero now saw him only as a beast. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was executed in Nantes. A crowd of thousands gathered, including many parents who had lost their children to his cruelty. First, he was hanged, his body swinging as a symbol of justice finally delivered. Then his corpse was burned at the stake, flames consuming the once gilded night until nothing but ash remained. The wind carried away the last fragments of his body, but not of his story. Witnesses reported that his final words were a prayer for forgiveness, a plea to God to spare his soul, and a warning to other nobles about the dangers of pride and excess. Whether these words were born of sincerity or desperation, no one could tell. But as the smoke rose into the sky, many whispered that the devil himself had finally reclaimed his servant. A shiver passed through the crowd, a sense that something greater than man's justice had taken place. Yet death was not the end of Gilles de Rais. If anything, it was the beginning of his transformation into legend. For years, authorities tried to erase him from memory, striking his name from records, omitting him from histories of Joan of Arc. But evil has a way of surviving. His deeds seeped into folklore, mutating into the tale of Bluebeard, the wealthy noble who murdered his wives and hid their bodies in locked rooms. The details changed, but the darkness remained immortalized in storybooks meant to frighten children into obedience. The attempt to erase Gilles de Rais from history was doomed from the start. People could not forget. They whispered his name in the shadows, mothers used it to frighten disobedient children, and priests cited him as an example of what happens when a man sells his soul. Even if officials tried to whitewash the chronicles, the memory lived on in the minds of villagers who had lost their sons. By the 17th century, storytellers began weaving his atrocities into fairy tales. The figure of Bluebeard, a nobleman who murdered his wives and hid their corpses behind a forbidden door, was born. Though the details shifted, wives replaced the children. Curiosity replaced ritual sacrifice. The heart of the horror remained the same. The idea of a powerful man masking unimaginable evil behind the facade of wealth and respectability. The fairy tale spread across France, then across Europe, translated and retold, embroidered with new fears for each generation. Children shivered at the warning: never trust the rich man who offers gifts too freely, never open the door that he forbids. The sanitized version obscured the blood-soaked chambers of reality, but beneath the pages lurked Gilles de Rais, the specter who had inspired it all. Criminologists, centuries later, would look back at his case with fascination. His crimes displayed traits that modern psychology would come to define as those of a serial killer: organized methods, careful victim, selection escalation over time, and the blending of cruelty with ritual. 600 years before the term existed, Gilles de Rais had written the textbook of monstrous behavior. What is most chilling is how easily he fit into his society until the very end. Medieval France celebrated ruthlessness on the battlefield, glorified noble arrogance, and allowed the powerful to act unchecked. The very qualities that made him a celebrated knight: his fearlessness, his disdain for weakness, his absolute sense of superiority were the same traits that enabled his transformation into a predator. In this way, Gilles was not just an individual monster but a mirror held up to an entire culture. His violence was an extreme reflection of values already present: domination, control, the silencing of the weak. France created him, rewarded him, and only turned against him when his darkness could no longer be ignored. That truth is more unsettling than any single act of murder. Even today, historians debate the scale of his crimes. Some argue that his confession was forced, that the number of victims may have been exaggerated by enemies eager to seize his wealth. Others counter that the overwhelming testimonies, the consistency of details, and the horror etched into so many lives make denial impossible. The debate itself shows how his story straddles the line between fact and legend, history and nightmare. Yet, whether he killed 80 children or 200, whether every confession was truth or part fabrication, the legacy remains. He is remembered not as a Marshal of France, but as one of the earliest and most infamous serial killers in recorded history. His name does not appear in the same breath as Joan of Arc in schoolbooks, but in the darker shelves of libraries he is ever present. The transformation of Gilles de Rais into Bluebeard, and then into a symbol of hidden evil, teaches a dangerous lesson that monsters often wear crowns, medals, or robes of office. They do not always lurk in forests or alleys. They stand beside thrones, bathed in applause, cloaked in legitimacy. That was the true horror of Gilles de Rais. He looked like a saint until the moment he revealed himself as Satan. And so his tale survives not as a closed chapter but as a permanent warning. Every generation that reads Bluebeard's tale or studies his trial confronts the same haunting question: how many other Gilles de Rais has history hidden? How many heroes applauded in their time-masked terrors no one dared to expose? The story is less about one man's evil and more about the silence that allowed him to thrive. The silence of the powerful was Gilles' greatest weapon. Local authorities hesitated to act not because they did not hear the cries of grieving parents, but because confronting a Marshal of France meant confronting the very hierarchy that fed their livelihoods. In their hesitation lay complicity. Each child who disappeared was not only Gilles' victim, but also a casualty of collective cowardice. It is tempting to think of Gilles as an aberration, a monster born in an age of superstition and cruelty. But the truth is far more unsettling. He thrived precisely because he was ordinary within his class. Nobles killed on battlefields, priests looked away from corruption, kings squandered fortunes, while peasants starved. Gilles simply turned that sanctioned brutality inward, targeting the most vulnerable instead of the kingdom's enemies. His crimes expose a paradox at the heart of medieval chivalry. The same knight who rode into war with banners of Christ flapping above him now committed acts that mocked the very faith he once served. Chivalry was not protection of the weak, but permission for the strong to do as they pleased, so long as their violence wore the mask of honor. In Gilles, that mask slipped, and what lay beneath horrified the world. When historians sift through the fragments of his life, they see more than a criminal dossier. They see a society willing to applaud a man in shining armor while ignoring the stains spreading beneath the surface. They see the danger of unchecked power, the fragility of moral systems built on spectacle rather than substance. Gilles is less a ghost story than a warning carved into the fabric of European memory. The Bluebeard myth, stripped of its historical gore, preserved the essence of that warning. A locked chamber, a forbidden key, and the fatal curiosity that reveals the horror within this was not only a tale for children, but an allegory for societies that choose not to look too closely at their idols. The door always hides something, and the silence around it is what allows evil to multiply. Modern criminology has returned to Gilles de Rais as a case study not to indulge in his depravity, but to understand the anatomy of evil. The careful grooming of victims, the rituals of power, the cold calculation of disposal. All these elements would reappear centuries later in the profiles of serial killers. He was, in a grim sense, ahead of his time, showing the patterns that human cruelty would repeat again and again. But perhaps the most terrifying thought is not that Gilles was exceptional, but that he was predictable. A man given limitless wealth status beyond reproach and the trauma of losing the one cause that gave him purpose, such a man was almost destined to collapse inward. His life is less the story of a demon disguised as a man, and more the story of what happens when human hunger is never checked by conscience, When we read of his trial of parents weeping and servants confessing, we must resist the urge to sigh in relief that such darkness belongs to the past. The warning extends to the present. Every age has its gilded heroes whose private chambers conceal horrors. The forms change, palaces become boardrooms, castles become gated estates, but the silence of those who benefit remains the same. Gilles de Rais's ashes may have scattered into the wind, but the shadow of his choices still darkens our imagination. He forces us to ask what is worse, the evil of one man or the collective refusal of many to confront it. In that question lies the enduring relevance of his story, the reason it resurfaces whenever we try to understand the darkest corners of power. The tale of the marshal-turned-monster does not end with fire consuming his body. It endures because it is not only about him, it is about the frailty of human institutions, the vulnerability of the powerless, and the terrifying ease with which reverence can turn into ruin. Gilles de Rais died in 1440, but the warning he embodies remains alive, whispering from every locked chamber we are too afraid to open. Centuries after his death, writers and philosophers continued to wrestle with Gilles de Rais's story. Was he proof that evil could grow out of privilege as easily as poverty? Or was he a singular aberration, a man cursed by his own obsessions? The inability to place him neatly into one category kept his legend alive. He was both knight and monster saint's companion and devil's disciple. In every retelling, the duality of his image remained. On one side, the glittering knight in armor, the Marshal of France, celebrated in banners and song. On the other, the predator, stalking children through corridors lit only by torchlight, the brock-marred sword gleaming as fear filled the chamber. It was the contradiction itself that fascinated and horrified. How could both figures be the same man? The answer, perhaps, is that the boundary between hero and villain is thinner than we want to admit. The traits that make men rise, ambition, fearlessness, disregard for limits, are the very traits that can turn them into destroyers. Gilles de Rais shows us that heroism and monstrosity are not opposites, but points along the same spectrum separated only by choices and circumstances. His autopsy performed after his execution revealed a body scarred and worn, a man far older in appearance than his 35 years. Some whispered that the deformities they found confirmed the rumors of a curse, proof that the devil had marked him from birth. Others saw only the toll of excess, sleepless nights, and unrestrained indulgence. Even in death, people sought supernatural explanations for horrors that were all too human. Bluebeard's tale carried his memory into the nursery, but its sanitized version obscured the truth. The story warned children against disobedience, but its origins warned society against something far more terrifying: the dangers of giving men unchecked power. To forget that deeper lesson is to miss the true purpose of the story, to reduce a real tragedy into nothing more than bedtime fright. In modern times, criminologists and historians alike have placed Gilles de Rais alongside names such as Jack the Ripper and Ted Bundy. He is studied not as folklore but as the earliest blueprint of the serial killer, a man whose crimes followed patterns of ritual escalation and psychological manipulation. In a grim sense, he opened the chapter of criminal psychology centuries before it had a name. But beyond criminology, his story haunts the collective conscience because it embodies the failure of institutions. The church looked away until he touched its interests. Nobles tolerated the whispers until debts gave them reason to act. For nearly a decade, society allowed his crimes to continue. The most frightening part is not that he killed, but that so many let him kill. That is why the story of Gilles de Rais echoes into the present. We live in a world where powerful figures still wear masks of respectability, hiding secrets behind wealth, status, and applause. Each era has its Bluebeard, each culture its locked chamber. The details change, but the mechanism remains the same: silence, complicity, and fear. So, When we hear the name Gilles de Rais, we should not think only of a medieval nightmare. We should think of him as a mirror one that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How many modern heroes conceal darkness we choose not to see? How many gilded halls still echo with cries we refuse to hear? His ashes may have vanished, but his legacy endures as both cautionary tale and cultural ghost. Gilles de Rais was not just the first documented serial killer of Europe, he was the embodiment of how power corrupts, how silence enables, and how legends can twist into horror. And until we confront the locked doors of our own age, the Bluebeard of France will never truly die. Perhaps the most disturbing truth about Gilles de Rais is not the blood spilled in his chambers, but the fact that for years, life outside those castle walls went on as if nothing was wrong. Festivals were held, soldiers marched, priests preached, all while children vanished. Civilization carried on blind to the cries of its most vulnerable. That blindness is the true curse that haunts his story. Think of the irony. A man once praised as God's sword, the defender of France, became its first great predator of the innocent. The transformation was not sudden but gradual, a slow corrosion of soul and sanity. Step by step, Gilles crossed lines each darker than the last until there was no way back. In that slow descent, we see the danger of tolerating small evils before they grow into monstrous ones. Some chroniclers tried to excuse him, claiming he was bewitched or driven mad by grief after Joan of Arc's death. But to blame magic or madness is to avoid the harder truth that human beings given unchecked power and indulgence can become horrors of their own making. His crimes were not the work of sorcery, they were the work of choice. Even the Church, in condemning him, revealed its own hypocrisy. For years it profited from his wealth, turned its face from the rumors, and only acted when his violence touched its interests. In burning him, the Church burned a mirror of itself, hoping the smoke would hide its complicity. But history remembers. The ashes of Gilles de Rais cannot cover the silence that enabled him. His execution in Nantes was supposed to be an ending, a final act of justice. Yet endings are rarely so neat. Parents who lost children did not get their sons back. Villages did not erase their grief, and future generations did not forget the legend that sprang from his horrors. Evil, once unleashed, ripples outward through time, leaving echoes no fire can consume. That is why the figure of Bluebeard remains so unsettling. Behind the fairy tale's locked door lies not just a murdered wife, but the bones of countless innocents. The story survives not because it entertains, but because it reminds us that beneath luxury and charm may lurk rot. It is a cultural scar, a wound disguised as folklore. In a way, Gilles de Rais is less a man than a symbol. He represents the thin line between saint and sinner, between knight and butcher, between glory and shame. He is proof that evil does not arrive with horns and claws, but with medals, titles, and smiles. And that truth is more frightening than any supernatural curse. Every era must ask, who are the Gilles de Rais among us? Who hides behind reputations, wealth, and applause, shielded by the silence of institutions? His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that evil thrives not in the shadows, but in the light protected by those too afraid to speak. As the final embers of his legend smolder, we are left with questions that refuse to die. What is the true cost of power? How much suffering is ignored so that heroes can be worshipped? And when the truth finally comes out too late for the victims, does justice ever truly balance the scales? And so the tale of Gilles de Rais closes not with certainty, but with a warning. A knight who became a monster, a hero who became a horror, a man whose legend outlived his flesh. His story is not locked in the 15th century, it breathes in every age where silence lets power consume the innocent. Perhaps the scariest part is this: the most dangerous monsters do not hide in forests or alleys. They stand beside thrones wear crowns of gold and wait for us to look away.